Hello, everyone. I invite you to this panel on this extraordinary collection of short fiction with this just exquisite cover, which I think in many ways speaks to the content of the book, you know, with its great sort of delicacy and its and yet its powerful sort of narrative value. You look at this cover and there's so much in it. It's strong, it's powerful, it's carrying a story. And so this beautiful book, a collection of short stories translated from Kashmiri, it's a privilege to be part of this conversation. So thank you, everyone. We have Kalpana and Tanveer sitting in the middle, Arshia at the end, and this is the way we're going to structure this evening. I think we'll talk a little bit about the context, the socio-political context of Kashmir in the, with reference to the work of Krishna Kaul, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about the stories, their literary evolution, but also, in a sense, the evolution of the situation in Kashmir over the years, and then we'll move on to talk about the translation and this rather extraordinary and unique process of translation, I think, which was a joint process. I just can't even begin to quite, imagine how you did it. It must have been such an intense experience. And then we can return to the book and we'll open up for questions afterwards. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the book, except to say that for me, what struck me was both the familiar and the unfamiliar when I was reading the book, because in that sense, the stories of the characters and the people, the relationships, they're recognizable. You know, there's a mother-in-law in a home that she doesn't feel quite comfortable with. There's a father and a son. I mean, there are all these different relationships which are not, in that sense, unfamiliar to us, and yet the setting is, I think, for anyone living in the South and not having lived in Kashmir and been through that experience, despite our imaginations, I don't think we quite understand the level of oppression, the kind of impact it has on the way people live and think and relate. And so that unfamiliar, you have to use your imagination to enter, and you know that you're never quite fully experiencing it. I mean, and the other aspect, I think, for people on the plateau anyway, is that we don't understand the cold. And, and there are stories, the title story, for example, where there's this intense experience of the cold, which is informing the entire narrative. And that, again, you have to use your imagination to be in that story. I won't go on and on. You know, there's the curfew, there's oppression, there's all of the situation in Kashmir. I would like to have Tanveer, if you don't mind, in fact, open that up for us, maybe by talking about the way in which the stories reveal what was and is happening in Kashmir.
Thank you, BIC, for organizing this, and it's been quite overwhelming over the past 1 week or so in Bangalore. We have been quite lovingly received and encouraged. This is our first translation, in fact, first attempted translation. I was very intrigued by the word, Indira, you used, reveal, because I think that is predominantly, and Arshia on my left might have disagreements with it, but I think that is the predominant purpose of the prose as compared to the poetry, to reveal. While as the poetry, in my opinion, this is a very modernistic view, is sort of, it's about perception. So it builds on the perception and it builds around the word from within the word going back into the word. I think the prose has it unlayers things. And that is, I'll come to that later. But to give you a brief context about what the milieu, cultural, social, or political was, when Hari Krishna Kaul started writing. Actually, the transition from poetry to prose in the Kashmiri society, the literary landscape, started to happen somewhere in the late 40s and early 50s. It was predominantly, the literary landscape was dominated by poetry. The expression, poetry was the dominant expression of the literature. And with all its political upheavals, where in this part of the world, predominantly, we were fighting a colonial empire in Kashmir. We were fighting a feudalistic rule for over a century. It was the Dogra dynasty from the Jammu, and Hari Krishna Kaul was born in 1934. So Kashmir was already in the throes of a freedom or resistance movement. And he grew along with this transition. So you can imagine there were cultural groups that were happening, that were getting formulated, and for the first time the city was also sort of expanding, and the literary aura or the literary landscape was expanding itself, and it was going to the rural parts of Kashmir. There were reading groups, and particularly after 1935, 1938, until the 1940s, mid-40s, there was a lot happening in the Kashmiri literature. And as we know that this is also the crucial time when a lot was happening at the geopolitical level. So those influences were also trickling down into the valley, and the cultural landscape was very much responsive to it. So it was responding in a way to the global, what global would have meant at that point in time. Hari Krishna Kaul, so this is the kind of backdrop where you see a social churning, a political churning, as well as a very charged up cultural churning taking place, which was kind of intertwined with the social and the political, spectrums of the life in Kashmir. Kaul started writing accidentally. In fact, he was forced to write. He didn't want to become a writer at all. But his name was put down in the Sri Pratap, which is SP College, in the literary club meetings by one of his friends. And he went there and he wrote this Urdu story, Ek Tha Raja. Once there was a king. And it was very much praised. But in 1955, I'm paraphrasing Kaul when he talks about his literary journey. To put it more succinctly, I think his literary aura could be divided into three parts. I will speak briefly about the two, and the third, Kalpana, will sort of supplement it with his third third part of his literary journey. The first part is when he starts writing in Hindi, and this is a language that had almost no takers in the valley. Very few people wrote Hindi. And then the Urdu was very much vogue, so was Kashmiri, and he starts dabbling in Urdu also. Then in about 1966, when the literary landscape had already sort of realized that what the euphoria around the liberation that they had felt at the end of the 1940s decade was beginning to unravel itself, and not everything was looking as hunky-dory as it was promised it to be. And a lot of the progressives, because the Progressive Writers Association in Kashmir was formed around 1949, 1950s, and this was progressive writers, then progressive artists, progressive theatre makers, so it was a larger pool of people who would come together. And you can imagine this like the 19th century France, when the Impressionism and in the aftermath of the French Revolution, though that's a gigantic picture. So this is almost at a minor level, at a miniature level, this is happening in this landlocked region. In 1966, one of the editor friends of the Kashmir's J&K Cultural Academy reaches out to Kaul and says, we don't know what you're writing. We have heard about it, that you're writing some great literature. But since we can't read it, we don't know. So why don't you just try your hand on Kashmiri? And he says, but I don't know the language. And he mentions this apprehension quite clearly in one of his introductions. And that is what we will come to later on. He says, I was not sure whether I'll be able to have the similar grasp on the language that I spoke, which my contemporaries and my peers around had, because most of them came from the rural background. So their language it was more flavored, its diction was more deep. Then he said that I thought, okay, why shouldn't I turn the lingua franca into a kind of literary idiom? And he does it so beautifully. And from 1966 onwards until 90s, he publishes two collections of story, which is Yatrazdane in 1972 and Halas Shurotul in Patlana, sorry, thanks for correcting me. Patlana Parbat in 1972 and Halas Shurotul, which gets delayed almost by a decade due to the censorship there. And it gets delayed because of the financial condition, also because there aren't avenues which one could explore. But at the same time, there is a lot happening. So Kaul almost joins a caravan of the writers, which is already underway, a landscape which is pretty much charged. So we'll come to the third part with the stories when we read. Then third part is when he is exiled from Kashmir in 1990, and he goes to live in Delhi. And we'll supplement that part, what happens after that. But 2 points, and that's it. He experiments with language. Kaul at some point becomes a way of seeing, way of saying / writing, but also a way of being a Kashmiri, what it means to be a Kashmiri, and to be a Kashmiri Pandit per se. How to negotiate that socio-cultural, socio-political milieu as a minority writer. And I will come to this later on with some supplements and some snippets from the story. I think that's pretty clear.
That's really, thank you for contextualizing that history and putting Hari Krishna Kaul in a sort of the literary landscape of the time. I think that really would help any reader. I want to say that, reading these stories and appreciating that sense of being a Kashmiri that comes through, it's so subtle, He never hits you in the face with anything, with the socio-political situation. It's subtle the way it comes through in the stories, in the relationships, the exile. Everything just emerges through the writing and through the literary, and that is a masterful thing, really. And I think it's extraordinary. I want to thank Rahul for bringing me this book and introducing me to this, Rahul Soni. So, and Arshia, of course. So I think then it would be really interesting then to get into the stories, to sort of how he actually talks about the situation he's in. May I hand it over to you, Kalpana, to walk us through the work?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, everyone, for coming here. It's really a delight to be able to present these stories, which a recent reviewer spoke about in saying this looks like it was a labor of love, which it truly was. Kaul was my uncle, my mother's brother. And so this was a project that I had planned for a long time, and it wasn't until with Arshia's help and Rahul's help that we found this collective of translators to bring this project to completion. So, but did you want to read about any of the stories, or did you, because you had said you'd wanted to read the stories, or would you like me to just go ahead?
Just go ahead.
Okay. So Tanveer kind of very nicely laid out for you the historical and the political context. And for just another 10 minutes or so, I want to take you back to Kaul the writer. I mean, yes, he's a Kashmiri writer, and yes, he's a Kashmiri Pandit writer, but he's a writer of, even if I say it myself for my uncle, a great literary writer, a writer of great literary texts. And he was a master of the short story format. In fact, his very first short story, that's the first story in this collection, Sunshine, really catapulted him to fame overnight. He suddenly became a celebrity in Srinagar, and everyone was talking about the story and his potential as a writer. So what I'm going to do is, we picked this selection from all the 4 collections of short stories that he has. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of a literary journey, starting with the early stories and how they are more traditional, both in narrative, but not so in theme, perhaps, because it's Kashmir and it's a different landscape. And I mean that figuratively and literally. And then I'll take you through his period of experimentation in some of the middle period. And then, as Tanveer was pointing to, I'll focus on the last period, which is the period of exile, where he wrote some of his best stories, and certainly, well, maybe not his best stories, but certainly the most hard-hitting stories, as you can imagine, but also linguistically and technically some of the most complex stories. And I'll try and unravel some of that for you. So the first story I'm going to read from is the second story in the collection, called The Saint and the Witch. And the saint in this story is Tara Chand, a man who has an enormous following in the city as a pious man, as a religious man, as a man with great deeds. And the story starts with his death. And there's a family group that's going to the house to start the mourning period and to be with his widow. And it also introduces Kaul's a major theme with Kaul, which is death and mourning, which runs through the whole oeuvre, in fact, and through this whole collection. So this is the first introduction to this. But for me, what's interesting about this story is Kaul did not have a lot of female protagonists. Sunshine has probably his most important female protagonist, but the protagonist of The Saint and the witch in the story, is another female protagonist. And the story really, I mean, if you think about downtown Kashmir, which is where Kaul lived and where his stories take place, at least the early period, it's, as we were discussing, it's 1 square mile. It's a densely populated, very tightly knit place where both communities live closely together. And yet they're separated, not by language or culture, they're separated by religion. But in that milieu, in that time, for Kaul to write about female sexuality and repressed female sexuality is quite phenomenal, and the story was met with a lot of problematic expressions, as you can imagine, and it was really provocative. But because it was done so beautifully, it again became a popular story, and it remains one of his most popular stories. So the section I'm going to read is about the protagonist, a woman called He Button, who was also widowed very early. And she comes to live in Tara Chand's house for a little while. And there, Tara Chand, for whatever reason, takes a liking to her. And he reads the Ramayana to her. He inculcates her into the daily rituals of Kashmiri Pandit life. They go to the pilgrimages together. And there's very detailed descriptions of that, which are probably some of the only literary descriptions of that period and that kind of life for Kashmiri Pandits. So here's the section. He Button accompanied Tara Chand on many of his pilgrimages. She traveled with him to Tulmul every month on the 8th day of the moon. Once Tara Chand even took her to Bhavan to perform the memorial rites for her husband Damodar, who had died so young. When they heard that a sadhu of great spiritual power had come to Chandigram, Tara Chand took He Button along with him to visit the holy man. They spent a night at the sadhu's ashram, then set out on foot for Sogam the next day at 2 in the afternoon. A cold shiver ran down He Button's spine as she remembered that day. She's walking towards the morning when she's to the cremation as she's thinking about this. A cold shiver ran down He Button's spine as she remembered that day. Without warning, it had started to rain heavily on their way home. They got drenched and couldn't get a bus from Sogam to Srinagar. It turned out that Tara Chand knew a government official in the area who was away in Srinagar. He asked the caretaker of the official's house to let them stay there. The caretaker started a fire so that both Tara Chand and He Button could warm themselves and dry their clothes. At around 5 in the afternoon, Tara Chand went out to buy mutton. He asked the caretaker for some rice, spices, and oil. He, Button, cooked the food in the kitchen, and after eating at 9 or 10 at night, she prepared the official's bed for Tara Chand. She pulled out a couple of blankets for herself, but couldn't get to sleep until late. It rained incessantly, and that July night felt as cold as December. After tossing and turning for a long time, when he, Button, could bear it no longer, she got up and slowly slipped under Tara Chand's quilt. As she was about to put her left arm around his shoulder, he awoke. When he realized that he, Button, was in his bed, he stood up. He washed his hands and face and sat down to meditate. He, Button's whole being was flooded with shame, and she rushed into the kitchen. She wanted the earth to open up and swallow her. Her eyes were swollen with tears. For a long time, she could not face Tara Chand. Thankfully, they left Tara Chand's house for Jawahar Nagar soon after. Before moving out, Ramju and his family had a bitter fight with Taravati, and they didn't speak to each other for 3 years. I'm not going to read the ending, which would give the story away, so it really has a twist at the ending, and it tells you not just about, there's 2 women in here that have been repressed sexually, and it tells you about them in a way that no one before his time had actually written in Srinagar, and it's happening with the names like Tarachand and with references to Tulmul and Chandigram. It weaves in the whole religious milieu, and, along with the idea of the sexuality that's repressed. It's a really interesting contrast. So I'm going to go on to a second story, which is also from the earlier phrase, which is called, in the translation is called The Tongue and the Egg, which I know Arshia will be talking about this earlier. We had a very, very hard time translating these titles, and this was one of them. And actually, I love the title of the novel, which for this collection, which comes from one of the stories and comes from a very famous Kashmiri poem, and I have to thank Rahul for that. He picked up on it on day one and said that's the name for the collection. But The Tongue and the Egg was a very hard title to come up with. The Kashmiri name is Kath Chizevhin Sawal Chutuluk. The writer himself, Kaul himself, had translated the story into Hindi at one point, and in Hindi it's called Katha Jeeb Ki Sawal Ande Ka, and which still doesn't tell you anything about it. And there was just no way we could get that rhythm and that resonance into the English. And these are 2 titles that I feel we just capitulated on and said, okay, The Tongue and the Egg is what it is. And this is a very interesting story, and Inder had asked me about the backstory to some of these, and this story does have a backstory, which Tanveer in his research recently found out. Well, we knew about the backstory, but we now have confirmation and corroboration for it. It really talks about political corruption at a time when, for lack of a better word, things were very corrupt in Kashmir. And it talks about an actual incident that really happened, and this would be what, 75?
71, 72.
71, 72, when Sheikh Abdullah was imprisoned, and his political opponent, Mir Qasim, came to power and became the prime minister of the state at that time?
It was the transition from prime ministership to chief ministership.
Okay, so he took over. And like many newly minted chief ministers and prime ministers, he wanted a new residence. And he decided to he had this residence built, and And it's not apocryphal, it is really true. He did ask his architect or contractor, whoever was working on the house, to go out and buy eggs and to mix the eggs with the cement so that his floors would look shiny and polished. So that's one of the backstories. The more interesting backstory, and let me read this first, and I'll tell you the other interesting backstory. So this is towards the end of this story. The story starts with, it really reads like a children's tale. When I first started reading this, I thought, yeah, this is going to be easy to translate. This is just he said, she said, the tall man came, the fat man went out, the short man sat down, the red man went away. So I thought this is going to be really easy to translate. So it starts off like a fable, a children's tale, and then you're sort of into it, 2 paragraphs, and you realize there's a character there whose tongue has been, taken away, and the narrator doesn't know. The character is the narrator's friend, and he's going to look for his friend, and he realizes that the tongue is missing, and this is the jeeb tongue. And he starts looking for it, and he's going up and down. He's visiting people to tell him what is this all about and why is the tongue missing. And he finds that people are keeping tongues in their fridges because they dare not take them out until it's necessary. So we get to the end of the story, and the narrator is now saying, he's asking about something that's happening out in the open, and he's asking the 2 other main characters in the story that are the sort of the official men, the policemen, if you like, or the government servants. He's asking them, why was he passing out these slips of paper? These are entry permits for the mansion, said the short one. What are these people going to do in these mansions? We'll have to see, said the tall one. They grabbed me and took me along with them. We entered a long corridor in one of the mansions. Here were the people who I had just been lecturing, lying flat on the ground, licking the floor with their tongues. What are they doing? I asked. What do you think they're doing? Said the tall one. The floor of this corridor has been constructed with the egg mixture in the cement. They're licking it in order to get the vitamins and proteins from the eggs into their bodies. I observed the scene carefully. People were lying flat on their stomachs like upside-down corpses. They were absolutely still. No part of their bodies, arms or legs, were moving. Only their tongues were working steadily. The tongue would emerge, lick the floor, and retreat back into the mouth, only to emerge and lick the floor again. I continued to watch the scene until the man dressed in white came in. He swept his palm across a corner of the floor and, turning to the tall one, said, "Looks like the polish is good." "Sir, there's no need for grinding machines now. We don't lack manpower in this country," the tall one remarked. "And when the spit mixes with the egg, the polish takes on a different luster," offered the short one. Then all 3 of them went outside. I stood alone in the hall and saw my reflection in the shining floor. The image was grotesque, and I was frightened. Did I really look like that, I wondered? Or was the floor defective? But who could I ask? There were many people there, but what would they say? Their tongues were busy licking the floor. There was silence all around. I debated whether I too should remain silent, but realized that between my friend and me, I alone had a voice. His tongue had been pulled out from its roots. Mine was still there. So how could I refrain from speaking? I decided to ask whoever I came across if my face was truly disfigured, or was it the egg and spit-polished floor that was deceiving me? So the interesting thing about this story is that a lot of the younger people who are reading it today and who have commented on it and written back to me, some of them in my family and others outside of it, have said how relevant it seems to their times, with book bannings and censorship and tongues being silenced. And the backstory that I promised Indira was, this was written much earlier, but not published until the second collection, which was 1985. So Kaul, was a professor at the local college, so there wasn't a lot of extra money around, and the only way you could get published then in Srinagar was if you had the patronage of the Cultural Academy. And so he wanted a subsidy for his writing. And he took this collection of stories, which is here in Halis Churotul. For now it is night. And he took it to the Cultural Academy. Excuse me. And we all knew this story, but Tanveer actually unearthed a letter in the Cultural Academy archives, which is really one of those fantastic Sarkari letters where he's asking for a subsidy, the writer's asking for a subsidy. And the secretary of the academy is writing back to him and saying, dear Kaul Sahab, thank you so much for coming to us, whatever. And I'm paraphrasing here. We love this collection of stories, but there's one story in this which is rather indiscreet. And that's in quotes unquotes. And if you're willing to take that out, we would love to help you get this book published. That exists in actual government archives now, Cultural Academy archives, and we have photocopied it, and we will use it somehow or the other.
Quick question though, is that letter in English, Hindi, Kashmiri?
It's in English. There's an interesting, Kalpana put it very politely, as usual, but I'm going to read the actual excerpt from the letter. It's 5 lines. The story, Kach Zebihans Sawal Chatuluk, which is the tongue and the egg, is rather indiscreet. As far as it has taken up a theme of an erstwhile VIP's coatee, believed to have been polished with eggs. This story may be deleted. The rest of the stories are all right. Letter number S 7677 5525, dated 16 March 1977, from In Charge Publications, Sales, J&K Academy of Art, Culture and Languages, Srinagar.
And I have to say, to Kaul's credit, he declined what would have been a 200, 500 rupee subsidy and said...
It has been...
Yeah.
It has had an interesting trajectory, and that tells us about the level of censorship, that how writers even now have to deal with it, negotiate their space, as well as stand their ground. So he writes the story in 1972, and 1971 Kashmir has already seen the transition from having a prime minister to having a chief minister. And then what happens after that is Cultural Academy has, they organize poetry recitation, gatherings, and as well as there is this short story writers gathering where they read out each other's stories to each other. So it is read in that one of these kinds of gatherings. But what happens is, he says, Professor Rahman Rahi, Kaul says this on record, the Gyanpith Award winner who we lost recently, that he admired, and he called it multi-dimensional story. A multi-dimensional story. But the editor of the Shiraza, they have a designated magazine for poetry, Kashmiri literature, and it has many versions, many avatars for poetry, for prose, etc. But the editor was somehow hesitant, because the practice used to be that you read it here to an audience, and then 5 of us, if we are reading 5 stories, we hand them over to the editor, and they get published in the next volume of what is called Shiraza, the Kashmiri Academy's magazine. He said he was hesitant, but they published it. But when I submitted in 76, when he submits this collection of stories for a subsidy, for a grant, for printing, which they do because it's the only patron institution still, there are no other avenues. He says, then I got the letter from a reviewer, because they hire a reviewer to review whether there's political stuff or whether it's all right. And this comes from the publications officer, not from the secretary. And what secretary is one of Kaul's predecessors, who Kaul holds in high regard, is Akhtar Mahideen, again one of the doyens of Kashmiri literature, short story essentially. He's the director, the secretary of the Cultural Academy at that point, and the matter goes to him. And he says, okay, I have read the story, there's nothing wrong with it. I have also heard it, I have listened to it years ago. But then the political transitions, they happen a lot in Kashmir. It has already come to the chief ministership, and from Mir Qasim, now there's Sheikh Abdullah, who has been watered down from the prime ministership to the chief ministership. And Sheikh Abdullah, very interestingly, says, no, there's nothing wrong with this story. And
because it's about Mir Qasim.
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong about it. There's no mention. So what he does is he writes a foreword. So this is like those message from the patron. So the chief minister is default chairperson or the Sattar of the academy. He writes message from the patron, and he says we have to give absolute freedom to our writers and poets and artists, so that our future generation knows that there is no censorship. So our future generation knows what was happening when these writers were writing. So we have to uphold the torch of free expression. And this is what the story forces him to say. And it's on record. I have it.
But it still wasn't published. So
it wasn't published.
The writer published it himself later with subsidy. I think I'll stop there because I think we'll go back to Tanveer and Arshia reading from some of the middle stories too, and then I'll come back to the later stories. All right. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you, Tanveer. That was such an interesting addendum to this, and thank you, Kalpana, for the readings and the introduction to his stories. You know, I have to say that one of the things that's lovely about this book is, well, it's translated by 4 translators, and at the end there's a note from each of you, from each of the 4 translators, their personal sort of relationship with this project, and contextualizing of the process for them individually. And I think that's really a very nice thing to include in the book. So thank you very much. And I think that then leads me then to think about, you know, here are these 4 individual translators, each dealing with these words, with these stories. How did you do this together? I mean, it's just extraordinary. Arshia and Rahul were the mentors. Arshia, thank you for being here to tell us about it.
Do you want me to talk about that now? Okay.
Well, since I asked the question,
Yeah,
shall
yeah.
I just do that?
Someone has to answer it.
Yes, so but there's also one more person that we have to thank, and that's Anmol Tikku, who really...
He just stepped out.
He just left. Okay,
Yes,
well.
yeah.
Okay, well, just remember, there's
Yes.
one more person who
Yes.
really helped this project to get going.
Thank you.
It has, you know, it has complex beginnings, this project, many stops and starts. But I do think actually that all translations are collaborative, right? Like somebody like myself, I work with Valmiki Ramayana, and it's not possible for me to translate Ramayana without knowing Mahabharata, right? I don't know it as well as I know Ramayana, but I certainly know the text. I also count a lot on previous translations of the Ramayana, and God knows there have been thousands into English. But that's very important because one is always translating into a context. Yeah, and so you read other translations because you want to know what other people have done, and what is inspiring, and you also want to know what cannot be done, what should not be done, which is appalling, which is incorrect, which is inaccurate, which could be offensive. So I think that even when we work together with real human beings as our collaborators rather than a tradition or a classical text or something, I think that's what we're actually doing together, right? That we're keeping each other true, as it were, right? And I mean, keeping each other true is like, you know, sounds really heavy and all, but it also comes down to very simple things which all of us experienced when you all were translating and Rahul and I were like, no, that's not working. Purely from the point of view of English, right? How it sounded in English. And we've seen the 4 of you just really battle it out over single words, like it was never used like that in my house. You know, or, no, you have the wrong tense, or where is the passive voice, right? So the great joy of a collaborative translation is sharing the pleasure of getting it right, and that you just feel like, oh, wow. And of course, you never get it right because, you read, I did Ramayana 30 years ago, and still I'm looking at it, mistake. Should not have done that there, and then that also is the joy of collaboration because you say, I didn't do that, Tanveer said to do it and see how it's looking, right? There's a way in which the act...
Sorry, it was a phone. Yes, go ahead.
There's a way in which the act of translation is diffused, but not in a way of diminishing responsibility, but really in a sense of... how do I say this? Having four minds instead of one. It's like having four thesauruses, thesauri, or 6 dictionaries or something. And especially I feel with something that is so contemporary, right? And so rooted in a colloquial idiom. Different sounds and senses from different people's experience of language, I think can only make it better. Yeah.
I did have a question just about the process. So did each one of the translators work on a story and then you came together to examine it? Is that how?
That's kind of how it's... that's how it started. Since I started the project, I was there from the beginning, and I with the help of a bunch of other older generation called peers, made the selection of the stories. And it's interesting because I'm a fluent Kashmiri speaker, but I do not read the script that Kaul writes in. He writes in Nastaliq. So it's not a script that I was taught to read. And so for me, it's in the back pages here. I never thought I was going to translate. I was just going to bring people together to a project that I really wanted to get done. And when we selected the stories, we also had them recorded over a period of time. And then we, with Arshia's help, we found 4 people, well, I myself and 3 other people came together at Sangam House, at the Sangam House Yali residency, which is where it all started, and Rahul was there too. And we did sort of give out the stories. You do 3, you do 4, I'll do 2, and all of that. And so that's how it started. And we each did our own first drafts. And I was working off of the recordings. And they were working off of the script because the other 3 of them could read Nastaliq. And when we then came together, it was initially going to be to just look at this draft by draft. And then we realized that it wasn't that easy. Some of us knew English better than others. Some of us knew Kashmiri better than others. Some of us knew the Kashmiri Hindu ethos better than others. And some of us knew the reality of Kashmir and the political overtones that, you can never get away from politics if it's Kashmir. So there was that addition that some of us brought. And so in each story, we started, refilling the canvas, if you like, putting back stuff, taking out stuff. And so that was kind of the first pass. And at the first pass, Rahul and Arshia were novice translators. For all 4 of us, this was our first translation. And we were working with 2 master translators who pointed out, the difference when you would do it in English, the passive voice, the active voice, the problem with tenses, which I still have till today. I don't know if it's just Kashmiri, but maybe Hindi writers too. I mean, the tenses work very, very differently than they work in English. And so they pointed all of this out. And then we went back home, each one of us, to work on this separately. And this was March 2020. And we all know what happened then. It was the pandemic. And there were two ways, like to rage or to endure. We could have just stopped it there and said, this is not going to happen. Or what we did was, I was in New York, Tanveer was in Bangalore, Gowhar Fazili was in Delhi, Gowhar Yaqoob was in Srinagar. We said, there's Zoom. And over a period of almost 2 years, a year and a half, we came together every weekend on Zoom. And that's when I think a lot of the collaboration and the collective attempts happened, because we were probably all isolated in our personal lives, and this was one way of breaking out of that and connecting and talking about stuff that we like to talk about. But then what we did was, because they separately, the other three, had started listening to the recordings. Now, Kaul, in addition to be a short story writer, was also a dramatist and a playwright. And everyone recognized the strong orality of that part of his technique that was filtering back into the short stories. And so we decided we would read the stories first together. And we listened and we read, and we listened and we read, and then we went back to correcting the drafts. And it was multiple passes, but for us, we had 2 years of the pandemic to work through with nothing else to do. And it was really both the, when I think about it now, it was that ability. When you're reading something, you're reading with your eyes, and maybe you're using your brain. But when you're listening, you shut off some of the other senses. And it was only then that the rhythm and the resonance and the poetry of the language came to us. And it was hard to translate a lot of that, but it did color the way we thought about the text and the many multiple changes that we made, if you want to add to that.
No, there's just one point I wanted to emphasize here, what Arshia said about the collaboration. I think what you mentioned already, I would just paraphrase you, that what stood apart from us, I think it stood out actually for us. The collaboration and the process of making a distinction between listening and listening collectively. And reading, I think, is more or less a process in isolation. But when we were listening, it also allowed us to reflect while listening. And all four of us, when we're reading it, then the consensus was, okay, but no, it didn't mean that. The voice is not only passive, but there's an internal monologue going on there. So structurally, it kind of, like she said, that the pandemic very awkwardly was a blessing in disguise, which brought this together. But somewhere we had also realized that it kind of evolved the methodological process so organically that we didn't think of this translation to be an individual enterprise anymore. And it became a collective exercise.
I want to also say that I think when we all started, happily I'm including myself, but I think, this it's like, okay, you do this story, you do this story, you do this story. But it isn't until you read all the stories together that you begin to understand, oh my God, Kaul uses this word for this. Right?
Yeah.
So the collaboration is also the stories themselves, and you get an oeuvre. And I remember you guys talking about stuff like this, and no, in this word, in this story, it means like this, and that's not how he uses it to mean that. And I think that, for me, like, watching from the outside, but as a sort of intimate outsider, I was like, that for me was so exciting, to see the collaboration is also the stories are collaborating, right? And they are showing themselves to you in a very, very different way. Like a lotus opens, slowly but slowly but slowly. And because you are together, you are able to share that, when most of us translate alone. There's nobody who get excited with you. I'm sitting with a Sanskrit text. Even my husband, he's not, I'm so glad that worked. But that feeling, Yeah, so I think you were able to, enjoy that.
And I think the only other thing I'd say that we didn't think about this while we were going through that, but at the end when Rahul And our US editor, this is going to have a US publication too, said, well, how do you want to put the translators' names? Do you want them against individual stories? What do you want to do? And to a person, we said no. The failures, the successes are all collective. So let's just put them through like that.
Well, I know I deflected from the reading and the sort of the literary arc of Hare Krishna Kaul, but I'm so happy to have had this interlude on the translation. It's really exciting, and to know how you worked, how you collaborated, and Arshia, your comment at the end that the stories came in. That's fascinating. Would you like to read then, sort of to the closing, and then we're close to.
Yeah.
Okay, so Arshia, as usual, I will read from one of her favorite stories in Kashmiri, and I can see 1, 2, how many people here know Kashmiri? Because it's we have an audience. Ajaz, you don't? Oh, yeah. Yeah. So this is the story where the title of the book comes from, Halas Shirotul, for now it's night. And the title comes from, like Kalpana pointed out, from a couplet by Dinanath Nadim. And Kashmiris would understand it, how we say it when it is too cold. It's thur, right? Zan b'magnis katkaras tulkatris pet shwingithosus. Kamros badi budai, the atmans eis trezain. Dairasas dith, magar timan eis nishish peti. Nebirkin es rudrat vasan, the pansail vav chalan. Ye vav, ye ban halich tzhat. Ye es at hostel kis kamras mas dav karan. The kamras under eisit the os eis basan, zan the eisis nebirkin shwingit. So in bistar eis baispet tripalas tal asne babajood te roda seri gumit. The eis as shoik daras kirai pet tretra kamla hesmas. Meus ak kamal fetis pet watrin traumas. The zasam wurin hesmas. Machnan te os ye kormut. Swami ji os no shwingit. Teme as zakamla panas tal asanik pet sajaimas. The ak kamal quaitan pet hodos kostam poet paran. Tur as me urgent samats. Kamras shanan to rokan asum dagisait ak ajeeb bekarari. Bosu sirif lairi firin divan. Machnos me nazdi kokut makut karit shwingit. Method as shanan pet atat the wunmas. Wala mesait you. Yek watai shankov nalamut karit. Shayad magasesh wishneer. Tem tu shano pet mion atat hod. The kalthoven kamlital suir. Sos me pet naraz. Bozo wait emsas naraz ki es napus ki. Ban hal wait till drevran mon zerait ratas rozo yeti. And everybody who has traveled from Srinagar to Kashmir would know this or back. Machne us wahid nafar ye met mukhalfat kar. Tem ko driver setha zor ze sakaitin bas. Raat kyut ki sahi kuni thikanas te baat ho. Mumkin magar driver zan aa wushna. Harga aiste aise makhnun pok rotmut. Mumkin ch driver ma aise bas kadnas pet majboor gumut. Magar aise kar chap. शायद आस आसमस वारिया सवाय रात क्युत बाइन हल बालस तरनस खोचमस खास करित येल न तार दिन वोल ड्राइवर ते एमि खतर रोजी ओस मखरन कोर वारियास कालस ड्राइवर सहित बहस मगर पोतुस होर वइन अस न तस तीचा ड्राइवर सन्स फशान यीचा तस अस सवारन हंस अस चरान मे आव न शंगनस व्यस्तार बवुतुस थोद तो ब्यूटुस लाइफ सहित डोक दित Swami ji kun karum nazar, sos puit bront ken varayvit, kya tam sonchan. Kya dalil ch? Tem prus me achav soit. Swami ji, tur cha sak. Me bonus. Tem karas nana. Kabar tai kya je tur laga? Me chan kya laga? Kat lagas tur. Bhagwan ne chubiot pod banomut. Char basha tur poran. Makran one laite se me yot boz. Over to Arshia, she will read the English version.
I don't know why I'm so attached to this story. I think it's because one of the first ones that you started on, all of you, and yeah. For now, it is night. It was so cold. I felt as if I was sleeping on ice. It was a large room and there were 3 of us in it. The windows were shut, but they were without panes. Outside, it was raining heavily, and the strong winds from the Pir Panjal came in gusts. This wind, this biting cold of Banihal, blew strongly through the room of the tourist hostel. Despite being indoors, it was as if we were sleeping outside. Our bedclothes were soaked, even though they'd been covered with tarpaulin, and so we'd had to rent 3 blankets each from the caretaker of the hostel. I had used one as a mattress on the cot and wrapped myself in the other 2. Makan had done the same. Swamiji, who was still not asleep, had arranged 2 blankets under him like a seat and had one on his knees. He was reading a book. The cold had entered my bones. My back, shoulders, and buttocks were aching badly. I was strangely restless. I tossed and turned. Makan had curled up and was sleeping close by. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Come, let's sleep in each other's arms. It might keep us warm." He pushed my hand off his shoulder and hid his head under the blanket. He was upset with me, and if I thought about it, his anger was justified. After reaching Banihal, when the driver had announced that we were halting for the night, Makan had been the only one who had argued. He had insisted that the driver continue through the night to reach a safer place, but it was of no use. If he had supported Makan, the driver might have relented. But we were silent. Many of us were probably afraid of crossing the Banihal Pass in the dark, particularly when the driver was not willing to do so. Makan had a long argument with the driver, but lost in the end. Now, he was not as angry with the driver as he was with the other passengers who had not supported him. I couldn't sleep. I got up and leaned against the wall. I looked at Swamiji. He was immersed in his thoughts with his book open in front of him. He raised his eyebrows to ask as if what the matter was. "It's really cold, Swamiji." He laughed. "Why do you feel so cold?" "I don't." "Why would he feel the cold? God has made him plump. Cold can't go through fat," Makan muttered so that only I could hear.
It was very nice when you were reading in Kashmiri, Tanveer, to
You
hear.
didn't like my English reading?
No, I loved it. I'm coming to it. To see the response of laughter when we couldn't understand it, was really, really lovely. And Arshia, as always, you're reading with perfection. I wondered, I know that we wanted to have more readings, but there is an audience here, and there's Anmol. We were evoking your name earlier to say you were part of this project too, so thank you. Do we open up for questions, and then we can come back to some reading if we have the time? So, questions, anybody? And Shania, we have a mic? Yes, good. Anmol?
Okay, I can try. This story, I have a question about this and I wonder what you make of it. It seems to me it has some of the stock characters that keep coming up in other Kaul stories. So you have this person who is a religious person, right? The saint. And you also have the revolutionary, somebody who wants to kind of change things, Makan. And the narrator is stuck between them. And it seems to me that in some ways one can read a Kaul's voice in the literary kind of options that are available out there, Soch Kral, all the kind of Kashmiri mystical poetry that still dominates to this day and age, and also the revolutionary Dinanath Nadim kind of thing. And of course, in these two seem to be the kind of poles around which a lot of Kashmiri life seems to be organized. What do you make of that this narrator is stuck between these two kind of stock characters, the saint and the revolutionary? I'm just curious about that.
I think that's, I'll start and then Tanveer or Arshia can pitch in. I think that's a good observation. And it's not just that the narrator is stuck between these two characters. The narrators or the characters in a lot of the stories are stuck. They are just plain, pure stuck. Whether it's the narrator of, I keep remembering the Kashmiri names, A Song of Despair. You know, the narrator is sitting on a ledge with his legs hanging, and he's looking at life going on in, that's curfew, sorry. The narrator is looking at life going on in through other windows, and the narrator of A Song of Despair is also sitting on a ledge and is remembering stories about various neighbors and commiserating about his inability to get a job, which the narrator of Curfew is also doing. So the whole the image of being stuck, and you can read a lot of layers. You can say that Kashmiris are stuck. You can say Kashmiri Pandits were stuck as a minority in this in this world where the Muslims were the majority. You can say the Kashmiri Muslims are stuck with nothing to look forward to and nothing to look back to. So I think as a metaphor, this inability to move forward is happening at a variety of levels. But it could very well be, and Tanveer is probably more equipped to speak about this, it could very well be that Kaul he was very extremely, he read a lot, and he read his peers, and he read Laldead, we know he read Laldead, he read Kabir, he read a lot of people, and maybe he's also trying to negotiate this himself as a progressive writer, but maybe not a revolutionary writer. I mean, he certainly wasn't out there waving the flag. He never did. And so maybe there's an element of that to it, and you probably can speak to that a little bit more.
But I think, to a certain extent, Anmol, that's very true. I mean, the predicament of being trapped comes across, but at the same time, there is an element of resistance. But, unlike Makhan of the Tomorrow, I think in many other stories which are part of this or outside, which are not published in this book, a friend recently pointed out that it was the theme of waiting that dominates there, because towards the end of it, the story, I don't know whether it is the no-exit-like predicament, the Sartrean existentialist predicament. It does hint at certain levels towards that. But a lot of stories, and I keep going back to this, that there is a lot of drama that is already unfurling behind these stories as a backdrop. And there is a lot of noise and cacophony around it. And at every situation, and it's a landlocked region, right? Everything is about getting trapped somewhere on the road. You are traveling. You get trapped inside a house. You get trapped inside your own, being. And to negotiate, you get trapped inside your own self. Those multiple articulations of getting trapped, and then not giving into that trap, but also resisting there, I think that is what he was doing. And therefore, he does it at the linguistic level, because he does not choose to write the way the others wrote. He picks up on the local language and it's one of the first examples in the Kashmiri literature to turn the daily speak, the conversational mode, daily conversations, and turn it into a powerful literary idiom. And he knows, for a reason, that the transgression, if you have to transcend beyond the limitations of the language, it can happen there. It's very possible there. And therefore, he uses these tools to my mind, to articulate a larger predicament of Kashmiri society, but not just through the idea of the trap, but within that element of trap, there is already a resistance that is brimming and building. And To what extent it will go, when will ultimately the lid burst out, he doesn't tell us, because he doesn't curate us into it. He doesn't lead us anywhere. He leaves us there.
And I think that's where the title again from this story, and maybe that's why Arshia likes it so much, is very important, because the poem that it comes from, the last two lines, it basically says, who knows what tomorrow will bring. For now it is night, for now we wait.
Yes.
And that's what all of this is about. And that's why it's, when we picked this story, to me, it was very evocative of what's happening in Kashmir. And for both sides, the Pandits and the Muslims. The Pandits are waiting to go back, I don't know. They're not moving. They've certainly moved forward, but the pull of the homeland is very, very strong. And there's definitely waiting for a homeland to go back to. And for the people who are trapped inside Kashmir, there is no morning yet. It's still night, but for now it's waiting. And it's the trapping, the being trapped and the waiting that I think dominate a lot of these stories. Not just these, but many of the others.
But at the linguistic level, if you see the paradox that he tries to weave into the titles, Paga, which is in anticipation, tomorrow, right? But that tomorrow never comes. It's a cyclical trap. Halas Rotal, we don't know how long the Rotal is, but we know that at some point the dawn is going to break. But he's not breaking it in the story. He doesn't give it away totally. So he wants to see, in Kashmiri we have a very famous expression, Ratul Shkrut, right? The night is very dangerous, or it's, how will you translate Krut? Difficult. So he tells you about the drama that unfurls in the night. And why night a metaphor here? Takes it very, sort of presciently from Dinanath Nadim. And there are multiple levels of intellectual tussles that are happening here. Paga, which is a very Mesham Ash Paghaj, right? I have hopes for tomorrow, Dinanath Nadim. I don't know what's going on in the story, whether it is an intellectual, sort of a retort or a response to Dinanath Nadim, who is very hopeful about tomorrow, but Kaul brings it back to the cyclical entrappings. And also, Halas Shurotul, Dinanath Nadim says that we have to wait until tomorrow. He doesn't say, he takes the wait into another sort of a literary representation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted, Arshia, if you wanted to just
Yeah,
comment on that as well. Thank
I mean, at the risk of being the bad guy in the room, the bad girl in the room, last night when we were prepping, we were talking about this thing. No, I think, Anmol, the things that you've pointed to, the sort of spirituality or the religiosity that frames a lot of these dilemmas that Kaul presents us with, I think those are dilemmas and frames of modernity as well, right? So all Indian writers in the 50s and 60s, all the progressives were negotiating exactly this thing, because modernity is what we're looking for. No, we don't want to be going to temples and saying, oh, fate and this and that. That is the big rebellion. And one of the things we were talking about last night, as we prepared for this session, was to also remember, Krishna Kaul probably thought that he was writing for world literature because he was responding to Eastern European existentialism. He's read Kafka, he's read Camus, right? So I think in a way and I use this word very carefully, to diminish his metaphors or his tropes or his landscapes to only Kashmir. Yeah, of course, some stories, they are only Kashmir. But it is also, he is a writer to the world. And I think that is one of the things that I'm so excited about this book. Because first of all, as you said, Indian South, what is Kashmir? Oh yeah, they've got those mountains and terrorists, right? We don't experience the cold, but we also know nothing about Kashmiri writing. Neither does the rest of the country. Right? So to add another great writer to the landscape of Indian writing and to say, look, this too is world literature. I think that's very important. So not to talk back at your question, Anmol, but I think just to pull the camera back, let the frame get wider rather than narrower.
Okay.
Thank you. And I wanted to add, actually, since I since I'm invested to some extent in the short story form, I think the other thing that I found very powerful, leading off and responding to your comment, is that when a writer is using these, what should we say, tropes? I don't like to overuse the word trope, but anyway, using these tropes to examine something that he's thinking about, the form is really powerful because you can return to examining similar issues using such a range of characters, using different landscapes, using different situations, and then it's not a tired examination, So I think the short story really allows you to do that, and so yes. Were there any other questions? Because I'll just check the time. I think we're all right. If there are no other questions,
I think you had a question.
Oh,
you do?
Sorry to put you on the spot, but
I didn't expect that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I thoroughly loved reading most of the stories. I haven't come, and that's where my question emerges. I haven't yet reached the part where you say, after his exile, how the writing and the technical aspects transformed and changed. And I wanted to know a little bit more about how that happens, because I follow what Tanveer was saying about the times when he's writing. So Sunshine, the story that he's writing, 1966, the very imagery of Kashmiri Pandit women in Delhi, soaking sunshine, and has a very particular metaphorical, figurative work happening there. But how does it shift really after 1990s? I'm curious about how you read that.
I thank you for that, because I was actually going to bring it back to just that, so thank you.
yeah, I mean, obviously, 89, 90, he was forced to move. And I use the word forced deliberately because he had no desire to leave Kashmir. And he, like a lot of people in the same boat, was literally bundled into a car, if you like. He bundled himself and his family into a car and left for Delhi, where his son was living. And took nothing with him, none of the manuscripts. They all stayed back. And so and I know this doesn't answer your question directly, but it hinges on some of the aspects of this translation that we've had, and we probably won't get to, is it was very hard to go back and find the original texts. And we only found them, fortunately, a copy of each collection in the university library, and they were not in very good shape. They were ruined by what the floods of 2014 had ruined some, and eventually we found we were dealing with unstable texts, and that's a story for another day of how we navigated that in the translation. But to your exact question, the writing does change, because if you think about it, and it doesn't change immediately. Yat Razdani was published in 1996, was the first collection after that, and that he's really sort of situating his stories more in Delhi and other some unnamed parts of India, and he's talking about. For me, that's the least favorite of my collections, because I find that he's trying to bring in elements that he's probably not very familiar with or cannot speak to in the way he could to the earlier elements. And at that time, he's also starting to translate some of his older stories into Hindi. He translated some earlier, but that was the time when he started, I think when he was not very happy with the way his writing was going, he went back to the older stories and started translating them into Hindi. And again, when I read the Hindi, which I can read, Devanagari, I realize that these are nowhere. As even in a translation, they lack what the Kashmiri originals had. So for a writer, when I sit back and look at this and I say, what happened here? Because he wrote in Kashmiri, which is a minority, it's within India, it's such a small community, if you take both Muslims and the Hindus. He really overnight lost his audience. And he was a dramatist, and his plays were done on radio and television, and he literally lost his audience overnight. So he does complain in a couple of the later forwards, but he doesn't know who he's writing for. He's become the migrant. The migrant that he talks about in the earlier stories is now himself. And he's renegotiating this whole, and there's no time to go into this whole relationship between Kashmir and out there. I mean, the Kashmiris in the room will understand that we Kashmiris have a very small geography. There's Kashmir and then there's the rest of the world. And he's renegotiating that because what was there is now here for him. So that's happening on the thematic side and the narrative side. A whole other shift is taking place on the technical side and the structural side. Language is becoming, it's not the language of the earlier stories. It's much more allegorical. It's much more symbolic. And when you get to the last story, which again was very, very hard to translate, both the title and the story, for those of you who understand Kashmiri, the original name of the story is Hurl. And we struggled with that, and we ended up with To Rage or To Endure. And Hurl is a purely symbolic story. It's a description, again, of snow in winter when times were good. And then it abruptly goes into that year, winter came again, but it was different. Obviously, 89, 90 winter. And then he describes this sort of mythical journey with his mother, the narrator does, coming out of Kashmir into a landscape that is not the landscape of Posh Kuj in sunshine. It's the landscape which is barren, where the sun is harsh, and it's beating down upon him, and his mother is asking about, we don't know anyone here. And he's saying, I mean, I wish we had time to read from that. It's beautiful. He tells his mother, no, we don't know anyone here. This is our situation now. And then he enters in a completely different conversation with the son. He says, it's the same son. And the son says, no, I'm not the same son. I'm a different son. I'm harsh. I'm warm. You're used to a much better son. This son you have to, and you're raging because you're used to the cold. But I'm the son of bright light and harshness. And the story ends with the narrator saying, basically saying, I don't have an option now. I either live here he doesn't use the word accept. He says, I either rage or I endure is how we translated it. And Hurl was so hard to translate because it's not getting accustomed to, it's not getting used to, it's taking on, it's habituating yourself, but it has negative connotations. I'll speak in Kashmiri for a moment. Archana Jan Jesus Hurl Karan. You make a habit of bad things. You get accustomed to bad things, and that's what he's dealing with here. He says he has to expunge memories of Kashmir, of the language, of people there, and he has to find a way, an accommodation in this new place that he finds. And Hurl actually ends not totally with acceptance, but at that exact moment of capitulation, when he's sort of just giving in.
Yeah, you were spot on. I agree with that.
Okay,
Definitely.
good.
There's so much pain in that moment.
There is so much pain in that moment.
I don't want to end on the thought of pain because really this book is a joy to read. It's an introduction to a world, but as you said, Arshia, it's also takes you into world of people, world of negotiating complexity, relationships, hardship, everything. But it's also funny, it's
Very
wonderful, and moving, and I think that you've had such a special introduction, all of you as an audience, to this fantastic translation, to this process of translation. We wish we had more time for more readings, but you can get the book and read it yourself. And maybe one day you will record these stories for.
We're thinking about it.
Yes.
We're planning on that. That would be create an audiobook about this. Yeah.
Because it would be a sort of continuation of that process that brought you all together in this. So I don't know if you have more to a particular something you want to add in a second or two, each of you, and if not, I think.
Please buy the book.
Yes, please buy the book.
It's out there, and I can guarantee you'll enjoy reading it,
yes.
even if I say so.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. I endorse that completely. So I thank you all. I thank you for being here. Rahul, Arshia, I'm just going in a circle, sweeping through Tanveer, Kalpana, and the two Gowhars, Anmol, everyone who was part of this project for bringing us this wonderful book. Thank you.